Make sure I'm unmuted. You all can hear me online. Cool. Got a thumbs up. All right. Today we're going to talk about pastoral systems, stalker systems. Do you remember last time, which feels like a week ago, which I guess it was, the last time we gave a lecture, we kind of introduced some concepts around grazing management, calculations needed to calculate stalking rate, forage allowance, how many head you can graze a given area if you know forage availability, how many Uh, and then the inverse of that, if you have to know the number of head that you have, how many acres would you need to have based off of a given forage mass? So we talked about all those things. Talked about concept of how as forage allowance increases, you're going to increase animal average daily gain up until a point, and then it'll plateau. At that plateau, that critical forage allowance value, you kind of have maximum selectivity where those animals are consuming the highest quality forage. So any additional forage allowance beyond that, you're not really going to see any improvement in individual animal average daily gain. That all makes sense. Any questions about that last lecture? I realized it was on Zoom. And I just learned how much I hate teaching on Zoom because no one comes off mute. So it's just me talking to myself, which I guess is fine, but I'm an awkward person and I don't want to talk to myself either. So, any questions to date? Okay. Okay. Today, I want you guys to know what states have small grains pastures. We're mainly talking about wheat pasture. Um, why is it localized to this region? Okay. Around how many head are grazed in that area per year? Okay. Um, when will that grazing time occur? Okay. Which is important due to that seasonality in cattle prices driven by supply and demand, right? When, you know, uh, like 80% of calves are born from January to July. So that means 80% are weaned from what would it be July to January, right? So because we have a cyclical seasonal supply of feeder cattle, we have a seasonal price. Okay. So when these grazing systems occur is important for that because maybe you're buying at a seasonal low and you're selling feeder cattle to the feedlot at a seasonal high, right? So it's about that market timing, which we've kind of talked about. Okay, so know how many cattle are grazed on small grain pastures. So we're talking about really winter wheat. So USDA NASS reports that number each year. Know how many cattle are estimated to graze in the Flint Hills annually. Okay, so we're also going to talk about the Flint Hills. Summer grazing of tall grass prairie. You want to get the quiz? Okay. Um, so that's the other big region, predominant region where we have stalker systems is the Flint Hills of Kansas. So that's eastern Kansas, pretty much as far north as Manhattan, and then as far south as northeast Oklahoma. So getting into Osage County. Okay. So big region called the Flint Hills because very shallow earth underneath that is not really flint. It's like shale. And that made it to where the pioneers, the prairie people could not break ground there, could not cultivate it, and so it allowed us to preserve that native rangeland that was there. Okay, so that's a big grazing region. And then I want you to be able to define a backgrounding operation, chiefly animals that fed in confinement. Okay, any questions? Cool. We've seen this slide before in one of our introductory slides. There's a large diversity in production systems spread across the U.S. Okay, so we have winter wheat grazing areas in Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas. Okay, summer grazing in tall grass prairie in the Flint Hills of Kansas and in Osage County, Oklahoma. Okay, summer grazing in high plains areas of New Mexico, Texas, Colorado. So that high plains area is short grass prairie. That Flint Hills is tall grass prairie. So we're going to talk about some of the predominant forage species that are found in those ecoregions. Okay. Fall crop aftermath or residue. So after they harvest corn or sorghum, you can turn cattle out and graze any of that residue that's left behind. Okay. Commonly done in Nebraska, Kansas. Cool season based winter grazing in the southeast and delta states. So unlike in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, these cool season plants would be perennial or annual ryegrass based and not necessarily small grain winter species. Okay. And then backgrounding programs where we're feeding cattle in confinement, um, often based off harvested forages. And this is scattered really across the U.S. The southern Great Plains is not really listed here, but that is evolving, right? There's more and more small kind of farmer feeder type producers in southwest Oklahoma where they grow their own wheat crop, they harvest grain, they harvest wheat silage, and they're feeding cattle a backgrounding ration to grow them in confinement. So that is happening a lot more so today than in the past. Okay, we've seen this figure before. Okay, I don't really care for you guys to memorize or be able to like recreate this graph, but I think it just tells a good story. Okay, remember where forages are grown is going to be driven by climate, so temperature and precipitation. So we have the hot, humid southeast. Okay, we have the cold northeast, which is humid, cold and humid. Okay. Bermuda grass doesn't like the cold. Bermuda grass prefers wet environments. Okay, so it's going to proliferate in regions where they get adequate rainfall and it's adequately warm. Okay. Fescue. Fescue is a perennial cool season grass. It likes colder climates, requires a decent amount of rain. Okay. So it's going to proliferate, but it's not just super cold tolerant, right? So it's kind of bound into what's called this fescue belt, which is pretty much this region that's outlined here. Okay. Kentucky, if you know anybody that goes to the University of Kentucky, almost every single one of their nutritionists are going to be doing research around tall fescue. It's like the number one forage, most important forage to their stakeholders. Okay. Okay. Eastern Texas, all the way through to Canada, we have our tall grass prairie. It's kind of in a transition zone where we're going from that humid east to the more arid west. Okay. Somewhere around here, we're getting 30 inches of rain a year, whereas here we're getting around 60. Okay. So needs more rainfall than other native species like the shortgrass prairie. Okay. Um, but does not like just super wet environments. Okay. Shortgrass prairie needs less rainfall. So in that more arid western environment, it is allowed to proliferate because it needs less rainfall than these tall grass species. And then you kind of have a transition zone where you're going from tall grass to short grass, and you have a mixture of everything, right? And they call that mid grass or like medium grass ecotypes. Okay, pretty much wheat grazing is bound. Northern Texas, all of Oklahoma, southern Kansas. You have some people that'll do it, some here in northeast Arkansas and into Missouri, but it's not just super common. And most of this is non-irrigated dry land. Okay. A unique ecoregion is here in western, kind of through the Central Valley of California. They have actual annual species that are natives, whereas most of these other native species are perennial. That's just kind of an interesting thing. Any questions? Okay. Grazing winter annuals, okay? Wheat pasture. So if we are going to plant this wheat with the intention of dual cropping it, growing calves, pulling calves off whenever it reaches first hollow stem, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and then harvesting that wheat for grain, We are looking at mid-November turnout, mid-March, we're taking cattle off. Okay. Right around that mid-March, that plant goes from being vegetative to start trying to develop a seed head. When that seed head gets above the ground high enough where animals can eat it, right, that plant won't produce any wheat. Does that make sense? Okay. So at the time at first hollow stem is what they call it. It's about 10 millimeters where the seed head emerges up the plant. That's where it gets tall enough for cattle to graze it. And so we need to pull them off of that wheat pasture if we intend to harvest it for grain. Okay. If we want to graze it out, so we just want to graze cattle on this wheat pasture, we don't want to pull them off and harvest it for grain, we're looking somewhere mid-November, turnout again, but stopping grazing early to mid-May. Okay, early to mid-May, that's when the forage gets pretty well played out and it becomes dormant, really low quality, cattle won't do so well. Okay. One interesting thing about graze out is during that early spring period, the grass goes through what's called a spring flush. So it goes through this really this rapid rate of growth. Okay, that's because temperatures are warm enough to where it maximizes forage growth. Okay, so you can actually in these winter wheat systems take half of your land and you can pull the cattle off of half of your land, concentrate them on the other half, and then you can graze out one half of it and harvest wheat off of the other half. Okay. So you're basically doubling your stocking rate during this early spring season because of that spring flush. And you can do both wheat and graze out. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. This is the latest report. So this is actually January 2026, not 2025. In 2026, there was 1.7 million head of cattle grazed on winter annuals in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So here's just a picture. Some steers grazing winter wheat. This is probably 1,500 pounds of dry matter per acre, if I had to guess. Okay. We've seen this picture before. This was literally, these two pictures were taken a week apart. Okay. Again, here we're probably somewhere close to 2,000, 2,500 pounds of forage per acre. Then all of a sudden, bam, snowfall comes. Cattle can't really graze because the grass is covered in snow. So you have to have a backup plan and be able to pivot to find another feed resource for these animals. So that's something to always consider. Okay. So small grain pastures typically experience what's called a biphasic growth curve. So in fall, you see a peak in forage growth. During the dead of winter, when it gets colder, it slows down. And then into early spring, it goes up, and it gets too hot, and then forage growth goes down. That makes sense? So here in wheat, early fall, you get a little peak. It slows down in winter. Wheat will not grow if the ambient temperature is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you start to see some wheat growth. So here, when it's really cold and you have lower average daily temperatures, wheat growth rate slows down. But notice there in early spring, that's that spring flush. So temperatures are ideal to maximize growth of that wheat forage. And so you see a huge increase in forage growth. It's because of that we can double our stocking rate, harvest half of our area, and graze out the other half. That makes sense? Alternatively, you could graze out your whole area and bring in more cattle to graze that other half. Okay. Any questions on that? Does that all make sense? Okay. Um, okay. Now, barley, and this is part of the reason why we don't really graze barley, has a huge amount of growth here in early winter, late fall, early winter, and then you don't really see much forage growth um, later on. But barley is more cold tolerant. That's why it is like the base of all animal production in Canada, right? And even in like North Dakota. Okay. So biphasic growth curve. In the spring, we have a spring flush. Um, Typically, it kind of goes into a winter dormancy. So slow growth rate, just kind of summarizing things I've said to make sure I hit all the points I want. For winter wheat, 32 degrees Fahrenheit is the critical temperature. So does anybody know what growing degree days are? Okay. So growing degree days is one way that you can estimate um, forage growth or when a forage, like a seed, will emerge from the ground. I don't expect you guys to know all this detail, but it is calculated as average temp, average ambient temperature, minus a critical temp. So that critical temperature is unique for each forage type. Okay. And so it takes X amount of growing degree days for a seed to emerge. It takes X amount of growing degree days for 100 pounds of dry matter per acre to be grown. Okay. So wheat will grow between 3.3 to 3.5 pounds per acre per growing degree day. So whenever it's really cold, winter wheat is not growing because it has not, the ambient temperature is below the growing degree days. Does that make sense? Yeah, what you got?
Like rye and ryegrass, they're not the same thing, correct?
No. Rye is a small grain. Ryegrass is um, not a small grain. So I think they're in the same genus, but different species.
It's like rye looks a little bit more like wheat seed, right?
It has a longer seed head, but yeah,
It's like ryegrass is like real fine.
yeah, and it's kind of, and we have pictures of ryegrass.
Didn't know.
It's got a like a flat blade that looks like it has serrated like seeds. It looks like it has serrated edges on both sides.
I didn't know if they like ryegrass or like oats or something.
Yeah. Triticale is actually a hybrid between rye and ryegrass. So ryegrass is going to follow kind of more of a triticale and wheat kind of growth curve. Make sense? Okay, you had a question?
Can you say what you're saying again about something about growing degrees and then it
Okay.
doesn't come?
So in agronomy, people use growing degree days as a means to calculate expected emergence from a seed. Also, it can be used for calculating expected forage production. Okay. So in essence, there's a critical temperature where that plant will not have an activity. Okay. It is different for each forage species, and for sure different for cool season versus warm season, right? And C4 and C3s. Does that make sense? Okay. So, for example, we can use growing degree days to calculate wheat growth. Okay. If we calculate growing degree days as average temp minus the critical temp, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, okay, we can multiply that 3.3 to 3.5 times the amount of growing degree days. We can estimate how many pounds of forage is being grown in that area per day, assuming it has adequate rainfall, assuming it has adequate fertilizer. Does it make sense? Questions? No dumb questions. Okay. All right. For this class, I want you guys to know 4 main reasons of why dual purpose wheat or grazing winter uh, small grain pastures is localized to Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. Okay. The first is unique climate. Okay. Fall and winter temperatures. So it's cold enough in the fall that we can plant wheat earlier and get adequate growth through that early fall period to carry our cattle through winter. Okay. but it's not so cold that the ambient temperature is not below the critical or the growing that critical temperature for wheat. Does that make sense? If you go farther north and you planted wheat in October, you would not have enough growth during that early fall period to graze cattle through winter. Does that make sense? You go farther south, it's too hot. Okay. Okay. The other big thing is relative. In that area, this area, we have relatively few snow days. Okay. Um, so we can get as much as 150 days of grazing typically in a growing period for cattle on wheat if we're grazing out. Okay. You go farther north, you get a lot of snow. Cattle can't graze that wheat because it's covered in snow. Right? Make sense? Okay. The other reason, Hessian fly activity. Got a picture of the little bugger right up there. That's a Hessian fly. Okay. You go farther south, the temperatures in that early fall period are warm enough to still support Hessian fly. That's why you don't really see much wheat grazing much farther south than here. You don't see as much as you do this far south as what you do in northern Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. Okay, does that make sense? Still have some people, but a lot of people are also grazing oats and not actually wheat. Okay. Um, so farther south, Hessian fly activity makes it so that a late August to early September sowing date or planting date is what sowing means. Planting is not a viable option, right? Because you still have way too much Hessian fly activity that'll kill that forage. So the Hessian flies kill wheat. Don't exactly know how. I'm not an entomologist, but they're not good. Okay. We need to plant wheat earlier so that it has enough adequate growth time to carry cattle through the winter. So we need to plant wheat. If we're going to graze wheat, we are typically planting in later September, okay, or earlier October at the latest. I know some people that have a lot of acres that they'll graze, they will start planting wheat in August, okay? Whereas if you wanted to only harvest it for grain, you're planting in mid to late October, okay? So this top graph shows the planting date or the different lines. So August 28th is up top. September 11th is the next one. The green one is September 25th. And that blue line is October 9th. Okay. On the y-axis is forage mass. Okay. So as you plant later, that you're not giving that wheat enough ample time to produce forage during that early fall or late fall period. That makes sense? Okay. And then here we have different seeding rates. So from 50 pounds an acre, 150, 200, what have you. So late August maximizes forage production for grazing. Okay. Then we have grain yield here, and these are the different planting dates. Okay. If we want to maximize grain yield, we're planting here in October. However, if we want to maximize forage mass, we're planting late August to early September. Okay. Okay. Back to Hessian flies. So this shows the Hessian fly count based off the number of the year. These are in Oklahoma from 2011 to 2013. When that early fall growth, we have low Hessian fly numbers. Early spring, we have a lot of Hessian flies. They become really active during warm season, warmer temperatures. They're less active in cold temperatures. By the time we get to these months, there's already adequate forage growth that the plant will be okay even with that increased Hessian fly activity. Okay. So Oklahoma is really ideal for winter growth, largely driven by Hessian fly, largely driven by when we can plant that forage and the temperatures matching up with our planting date. Okay. Another benefit is soil type. So it allows for winter wheat to be grazed without causing too much compaction because there's good soil aggregate. So that soil is relatively stable so that even as we get more hoof action across that pasture, okay, it's not having too much compaction. So what would happen if we had soil that's way compacted? Crops won't grow as good. You will have less water penetration. So you have water pooling instead of seeping into the soil. Okay. But because Oklahoma, northern Texas, Kansas soil type is relatively stable, relatively high sand content, it is not immune, but it stands up better to that grazing activity, that hoof action of these cattle on the soil causing compaction. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. Then one other benefit is northern Texas, Oklahoma, southern Kansas just has a, and this may not be a benefit, right? It just has a lower potential to produce grain. Okay. A really good grain yield in Oklahoma could be 30 bushels per acre. Really good grain yield in northern Kansas is like 70 or 80, right? So my dad grew up and they did this farming practice. He was telling me stories, talking to a friend from northern Kansas. They're talking about how much wheat they produced. And that Kansas guy was like, why even plant it if you're going to expect a crop failure, right? So to those people in Kansas, a 30 pounds or 30 bushels per acre grain yield is really poor. But to Oklahoma, it's relatively good. So it makes more economic sense to diversify your operation and get money from grazing and grain potentially if you decide to harvest. Does that make sense? So it's not necessarily a benefit that this area produces lower yielding wheat, but it is in the scope of uh, making it feasible to use for grazing. Make sense?
Like crop insurance, it's like that, it's same as like corn, where they can get some kind of subsidy.
For sure. Friend in southwestern Oklahoma, that's basically their yearly income is based off crop insurance. Um, and with that, there's only so much like that they'll allow you to harvest for hay. There's some what X% of their acreage you can only harvest for hay if you're filing an insurance claim. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Any questions? So if I ask you, why is wheat grazing systems localized to those three states? You can list me 4 reasons. Don't have to go into the whole explanation. Okay. All right. Importance of planting date. Grazing wheat needs to be planted sooner. Okay. Um, so, okay. You also need to plant wheat at a higher seeding rate if you're using it for grazing. Okay. For grain only, you'd want to plant somewhere around 45 to 60 pounds per acre. That's pounds of seed per acre. For grazing wheat purposes, dual purpose or graze out, should be planted somewhere around 90 to 120 pounds. Rule of thumb is, uh, uh, I had a rule of thumb. Oh, basically grain only, it's about a bushel an acre, right? Okay. Varieties, some varieties are better suited for grain only, some are better suited for dual purpose, okay? Here we have 2 graphs. One's in Logan County, which is where Stillwater, Oklahoma is. One's in Barber County, Kansas. And then they have different varieties. So 1863 is a wheat variety that was planted. Ruby Lee, Iba, Duster, those were planted in Kansas. And then we have WB Cedar, Everest, Double Stop CL Plus, or Duster. Okay. The green bar is non-grazed, so that's wheat only, harvesting grain only. The blue bar is grazed. Okay. So you can see some have a really high grain yield. Okay, if they're used only for grain harvest. However, you lose 5 bushels per acre if you graze that 1863 variety, for example. Okay, compared to Duster, if you do grain only, you actually have a lower grain yield than if you graze it. Kind of interesting. Um, so variety is important. Want to match your variety to what your system is in terms of if you're going to harvest that wheat for grain or grain and grazing. Okay. Tillage method is important. Okay. Here, this is a study that me and my dad published, actually. Okay, so we have conventional till versus no-till. So who knows what conventional till is? Plowed it up. Okay. What is no-till? Yep. So you're in conventional till, you'll run a plow, disc, you're working the ground, you're turning it over, you're conditioning the soil to provide a good environment for that seed, good soil contact. You're trying to make all the conditions perfect for that plant to grow. In no-till, your drill has a coulter, so this coulter will cut into the ground, and then it'll have these disc openers. So these disc openers will open that soil. So the coulter makes the initial cut. These disc openers kind of open that soil a little bit better, and it drops seed into the unconditioned soil. Okay. So why would no-till be a benefit? Keeps moisture in the ground. Um, you have less soil erosion. Um, less times driving the tractor through. Why would conventional till be a benefit?
Real awesome.
Yeah, but you're buying a no-till drill versus a plow and having to replace discs. You ever bought discs? Like a 40-foot disc would require like $40,000 worth of of discs to replace them when they get worn out. Something like that. Worked at my uncle's farm equipment dealership, and we would sell them by the boxes. Of course, we marked it to where we were making like $1 a piece, right? But conventional till had greater forage in the fall, okay, compared to no-till. So these are the bar. This is forage mass, okay. I think these would be the same. Oh, these are 2 different years, but forage mass. Conventional till produced more forage in the fall. However, you switch to the spring, and no-till actually produced more forage. Then here, this is when graze out would happen. Okay, so this is the second year. Graze out would have happened here. So in the spring, no-till had more forage production. I think I say in the slides here, no-till, because you're not disrupting the surface, because you're not aerating the soil, right? It holds water a lot better. Okay. So in springtime, when it warms up and you have a lot more evapotranspiration, so evaporation of water and soil, okay, that no-till kept a higher soil moisture and allowed that forage to grow more in the spring for no-till versus conventional. Does that make sense? Okay. So here we got the data from that study. Okay, tillage method, despite a little less forage mass in the fall, there was no difference in performance. Okay, so this is fall winter grazing. CT is conventional till, NT is no-till. So you can see p-values there. There were no significant difference in average daily gain per head or gain per acre. Okay. Also, we had the same number of grazing days. However, in the spring, so we sold those animals for spring graze out. We bought a new group of animals in. in the spring, no-till had a higher initial body or final body weight, higher average daily gain, more gain per acre, and also more grazing days. Okay. So because of that added forage mass that we got from no-tilling in the fall or the spring graze out period, okay, we were able to support more grazing days, and those animals had greater gain per day. So total system, total gain was about 60 pounds difference per acre. And then grazing days was about 10 more grazing days per season. Okay. So maybe if you're doing if you are harvesting grain only, maybe you want to do a conventional till. If you're going to graze that wheat out, maybe you'd prefer to do a no-till system for that greater water holding capacity of the soil and supporting more forage mass in that springtime. Questions? Okay. Other grazing systems. Okay. You can graze overseeded winter annuals. Okay. If I am in this area, this is probably very common here. Okay. I've got Bermuda grass pastures, probably predominantly. Maybe a little tropical species like Bahia grass, Dallas grass, something like that. Those species are growing in the summer. Once you get to the fall and going through the winter, they're not going to be active. They're not going to be producing any forage. You may have some stockpiled dormant grass that you can get some grazing out of, but that's likely going to play out by December. Okay? So, something that's very common in the southeast, you come into that dormant sod and you interseed, so you direct drill through that sod, which has the dormant species in it, different winter annual. Most commonly is annual ryegrass. Okay. Typically, we're planting that this far south sometime in October, aiming to start grazing it late December, and then we can graze it through probably May. Okay. Any questions? So this is very common southeast U.S., Louisiana through the Carolinas. Okay. It's actually a picture from the farm where I grew up at. There we have some cows that are grazing annual ryegrass. There we actually just converted this from trees, so they came in and clear cut it. We burned all the brush and then planted some Bermuda grass, and this was the winter, and we interseeded some annual ryegrass. Okay, so Lolium multiflorum, native to Europe. Okay, so it's an introduced species here. That's what the seed head looks like. So you can see what I was saying. It has the head, and then on either side there's a bunch of seeds that looks like serrations. So you guys may have seen this before. So recommended, you want to establish. So if you're sowing into a cultivated field where you're turning that soil, you drove a disc or a plow through it, you disturbed that soil, turned it over, it's all fluffed up, ready to go. You can start planting around September, aiming to turn out and graze sometime around mid-November, so very similar to wheat. Okay. And your grazing is pretty much going to be done by late May. Okay. If you're interseeding it into a dormant warm season pasture, like what I just described, you'll want to plant sometime around October, expect to turn out cattle to graze mid-November, and then grazing will be done by late May. One benefit of doing this with a interseeded is around late May, you start having that flush of new growth from your warm season perennial pastures. Okay. Interseeded will be less productive, will have less forage mass grown if it's direct drilled and interseeded into an established sod of warm season perennial pastures than if you put it into a cultivated seed bed. Okay. And then this graph here just shows these are the different months of the year. This is forage mass. This is annual ryegrass. So you can see, just like with wheat, we see a big increase in growth during that spring flush. Pretty well plays out mid-May, early June. And then you see a little peak of growth in that fall period. Okay. Any questions? Okay. All right. Grazing summer native range. Okay. Native range, native pastures, Flint Hills of Kansas. So these are going to be all based in tall grass prairie species. Okay. So they're warm season grasses. Typically, they're perennial. You will turn for graze out in early May. And then if you're doing what's called intensive early stalking, you will stop grazing in mid-July. Okay, that's about a 75-day grazing period. If you are doing season-long stalking, you will still term out uh, early May, but you'll graze them until early September. So about 150 days of grazing. Okay, so one unique thing about grazing warm season perennial pastures is that you can do intensive early stalking or season long stalking. Intensive early stalking is usually only done in tall grass prairie species. Okay. You don't really see people intensive early stalk introduced improved like Bermuda grass. They're typically going to do season long. Okay. So if you're doing intensive early stalking, you're going to double your stalking rate relative to a season long stalking, but you're going to do it for half the time. So you're doubling your stalking density, but you're grazing for half the time, okay? Compared to season long stalking, you're doing it for uh, twice the amount of time, but double the stalking density. So your stalking rate ends up being the same. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, Flint Hills, Kansas, Osage County, Oklahoma, covers around 6.4 million acres. It's one of the last remaining ecosystems that are predominantly native rangelands in the U.S. Everything else has pretty well been tilled, cultivated. We're growing crops, etc. You have other patches of native rangelands, but this is by far the largest in the U.S. Okay, we will graze about 1 million head in this area each year, and so these producers are, and I don't expect you to remember this, but these producers are contract grazing typically. Okay. The other thing, these farms have been established for a long time. You can't really go in and buy new land over there. Okay. So they're passed down, been in families for over 100 years. Okay. They're contract grazers. So similar to contract feeders, where you have someone that owns the cattle and then pays them yardage to feed cattle on a feedlot. There's a similar thing. People own the cattle. They pay a contract to the land manager, the producer there, and he will charge them for care and some X cents per head per day. Okay, so that's very common. They may also buy in their own cattle. Okay, but this is predominantly stalker. Very few. I'm not going to say none, but very few cow-calf. Okay, and it's all seasonal grazing. Okay, so you also have some tall grass prairie in, oh, so this is another little ecosystem, short grass prairie, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, but kind of a similar thing. Typically will be a seasonal grazing. Now, in that area, in the short grass prairie, you're probably getting into more cow-calf, okay? But you still have some stalker producers that will seasonally graze, implement intensive early stalking or season-long stalking, and that's all going to be short grass prairie. Okay, any questions? Yep.
Do they, even though they do like it by contract and they've been doing it for so many years, do they still like do kind of like rotational grazing there or anything like
Nope.
that? Or pretty much just
All,
throw 'em
this
out?
is my area of land, throw them out.
Got it.
Yep.
What's the difference in like rate of gain on those cattle from, I guess, the summer native range versus like a winter annual?
Winter annual is going to be much higher, right? Winter annual can be anywhere from like 2 to 2.5 pounds a day. Okay. Summer grass is going to be somewhere around 1.5 to 2. It's going to be higher for in the early season for both. So in wheat, you'll have a lower average daily gain during that spring graze out period. You have more forage mass, but it's going to be lower quality. Okay. And then for the summer, it's the highest quality you'll ever be in that year during May. And then the quality kind of goes down from there. Oops, excuse me. Other questions? Okay. All right, so here's just some pictures. Cattle grazing out in the Flint Hills of Kansas. This is probably sometime in May. Okay. Another group of cattle grazing tall grass prairie out in Kansas. Also probably a pretty early season. These pictures, most of these are coming from this one, that one, this one, are all coming from the Reynolds Ranch, which is Kansas State's kind of large uh, research station that they have for doing this work with this type of pasture systems. Okay, this is a picture from Oklahoma. These cattle were actually on my master's project. This is the same pasture. Okay, this was taken in May. Different groups of cattle. This was taken in May. This one was taken in October. No, mid-September. Okay, so you can just see just visually, much greener, going to be higher quality, early growth, compared to most of this green stuff you see in there is Serratia lespedeza. But you can kind of see behind that group of cattle that tall grass prairies put out a seed head. Most of that's Indian grass, but they put out a seed head kind of starting to go dormant, so much lower quality. Okay. I want you guys to know the big four. Okay. Indian grass, so these are the big four tall grass prairie species. We have Indian grass. Okay. This is actually in the same family as sorghum. Okay. Family or genus, I don't know, scientific names. Switchgrass, little blue stem, and big blue stem. So those will be the predominant forage species that are grown in these tall grass prairie environments. Okay? Yes. No. Nope. Just the common names. Good question.
Like the Eastern grass, it that breaks the acid poison type deal.
Not as bad as like Johnson grass, which is also in that same family. But you can get an issue with photosensitization through saponins. Yeah, that's probably the bigger thing. And it's much worse in switchgrass than in Indian grass. Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So these are 4 examples of common shortgrass prairie species. So we have blue grama, buffalo grass, side oats grama, and western wheatgrass. Notice western wheatgrass looks kind of similar to annual ryegrass, but they're not related. Okay. Okay. Class ends at what time? 11:20? Is that what you said? Okay, we're good. All right, so shortgrass prairie. This is an interesting study that was done by E.J. Rayner whenever he was a postdoc at the USDA in Nunn, Colorado. They did a long-term grazing study, started in 2000, stopped it in 2018, and then they compared it to kind of a historical results by Beement that was published in 1969, where they looked at data from 1940 to 1963. And what they did was they looked at the optimal stocking rate of these pastures and they compared it to this historical estimated optimal stocking rate to what they're seeing in the modern stocking rate. Okay. So modern, so from 2000 to 2018, optimal stocking rate average across all years was determined to be 9.4 animal unit days per acre. So these animal unit days are per hectare. So that's why they're not matching up, right? How many acres in a hectare? Oh, that's acres in a section. There's 2.47 acres in a hectare. It's about 2.5 acres in a hectare. Okay. So so that is 72% higher than the historic estimate. Okay. Um, then they split it up. So this is a good rainfall years, and this is poor rainfall years. So in good rainfall years, they were able to increase the optimal stocking rate. In poor rainfall years, that optimal stocking rate had to be decreased. Should make sense. Poor rainfall years, they have less forage growth. Good rainfall years, they have more forage growth. Make sense? Okay. But that historic stocking rate determined by Beament, published in 1969, is still lower than the optimal stocking rate for a poor rainfall year environment for the modern stocking rate. Okay. That change in optimal stocking rate between historic to modern optimal stocking rates is driven by this western wheatgrass becoming more productive. It started becoming a larger percent of the above ground sward. So made that whole landscape more productive because western wheatgrass grows more than these other shortgrass prairie species. Okay. Any questions? All right. Major summer stalker production programs continuing. Okay. Um, obviously, we can graze summer, improve pastures. Okay. Typically, we're going to do that season long, so about 140 to 150 days. Start early May, graze them through September. Bermuda grass, southeast to around here. Okay. Then we have fescue, which is actually a cool season grass, but you would want to graze that. Really, I mean, fescue grows a lot in the fall, and then it really goes dormant through the middle of the winter when it's really cold. Then it grows a lot in the spring. So that's one of the reasons why you see fescue more so used in the cow-calf side than necessarily stalkers. But you will have some people graze fescue pastures throughout the summer whenever the fescue is being grown with some other warm season grass to carry the grazing through the middle of the summer. Okay. Brome orchard grass. So this is a cool season, very common, New Nebraska, Missouri. Okay. Here's just a picture of some cattle grazing Old World blue stem. See, this is, I think these were Mexican cattle. I took this picture when I was doing my master's at Oklahoma State. So this is one of those pastures there in Stillwater. Yep, so they're grazing kind of midsummer Old World blue stem. Old World blue stem is not a native species. It's introduced native to India. Okay. Then grazing summer native range on annual warm season pastures in like California, Coastal Plain, and the Central Valley region. You don't have to remember all those. Okay. You can graze cover crop, or not cover crop. You can graze cover crop, but you can graze stalkers on crop residues. So you go through, you combine, harvest the grain, then what's left out in the field is any gleaning, so any grain that was blown out the back of the combine, and then leaf and stem material from your plants. Typically, you turn cattle out, they'll go around and clean up all the corn first, and then they'll start grazing that the actual residue of those plants. Okay, very common in Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas. It's very common for people to overwinter weaned calves on crop residues and then graze them, grow them in summer pastures to make them whenever by the time they enter that feedlot, they're long yearlings, so like 18 months old. That makes sense? Like three qu- 3/4 of a pound a day. Oh, for sure. Yep. Probably not as much at the start, but as they're getting to where they picked all the really good stuff. Also, these are usually pretty short durations. Okay. So you can do this with corn, like in this picture. You can also graze behind sorghum. Okay. And then finally, getting into backgrounding programs. So cattle that are grown in confinement. Okay. Typically based off feeding a diet that's based on conserved forages. Could be alfalfa or grass hay, could be corn silage, could be wheatlage, which is just wheat silage, right? So it could be a lot of things. Um, very common throughout the U.S., Midwest, East, and the Plains. Um, Importantly, you can do this practice year long as you have access to feed resources to do it, right? Um, and this can vary in degree of capital investment uh, and complexity. So, by capital investment, do you need to have a concrete bunk to feed your cattle in with a very expensive horizontal feed truck, horizontal mixer feed truck, or can you provide hay in a hay or in a ring and then supplement separate, right? So backgrounding cattle does not have to be done in a feed lot, right? It can be done in a dry lot where you're feeding these things separately. Okay. So this would be an example, obviously, of something that costs a lot of money to build. This concrete bunk, this welded pipe on the bunk line, all the welded pipe that are separating the pins. Obviously, this is going to have a high capital investment. We have to have a large commodity barn to store all these commodities. We have to have the hay ground. We have to mix it with a mixing wagon. Could be vertical, could be horizontal. We'll talk about that later. Okay. So large capital investment. Okay. Uh, or very low capital investment. I thought this was interesting. They're literally strip grazing a silage pit. So they have electric fencing that are keeping cattle stood off. They will move this electric fence to get them closer. They're just allowing cattle to reach across the electric fence, reach under the electric fence, and eat that silage directly from the pit. Kind of cool. They don't even really have a bunker. They used hay bales on either side of their silage pit to make the walls for the pit, right? Okay. Or we could feed cattle in a dry lot, have a hay ring, and then supplement them ground corn or whatever else separately. Okay. Main thing from this lecture: no wheat, okay, grazing, no Flint Hills of Kansas grazing. They represent close to 2.8 million head of stocker cattle each year. So they're the biggest production practices in the U.S. for backgrounding cattle or growing cattle. Okay. And then be able to give me a good definition of backgrounding and confinement, right? Does not have to be done in a feedlot per se. Okay. And I'm done. We're all good. You guys can leave.